Hey guys, Dr. Brad Bodle here, and I don't know about you, but I grew up in an era where the low-fat diet was all the rage. And whether it was the posters at school or commercials on TV, it seemed like just about everyone was eschewing things like bacon and eggs for breakfast and instead promoting heart-healthy and low-fat options such as cereals and oatmeal. Since that time, however, opinions have changed. But those recommendations to avoid dietary fat continue to influence our nutritional choices to this day. So in today's video, we're going to go over both high-fat and low-fat diets and give you some clinical recommendations. That way you can make the best choice for your Hashimoto's and thyroid symptoms. And just as a reminder, if you like learning about natural strategies like nutrition and lifestyle to help you to improve your energy, lose weight, and manage your Hashimoto's symptoms, I make and release new videos on these topics every single Thursday, so like, subscribe, and click on the bell. That way you don't miss any of the new content. So starting in the late 1970s and reaching into the 1980s and 1990s, reducing dietary fat intake was a huge component of the United States' nutritional guidelines. The main thought here was that more fat in our diet led to higher blood cholesterol levels, which then would increase the risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke. Not to mention the fact that a gram of fat also has more calories than a gram of protein or carbohydrates. And with the continued upward trend in people becoming overweight or obese, this was also a potential management strategy for helping people to lose weight. Oftentimes it became a game of how low can you go? And the interpretation was the less fat that you eat, the better off you're going to be. But as a national community, we soon realized that that wasn't always the case. Eventually, feelings and opinions shifted, and we started to accept that, yes, fat is okay, but we put in a caveat saying that only some fats are okay. Usually this meant polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats, or the ones that come primarily from plant foods, were fine, but saturated fat and the fats that came from animal foods were still considered to be fairly dangerous. Nowadays, public opinion hasn't shifted a ton, and most people still feel that unsaturated fats tend to be more heart healthy and saturated fats should be limited. And in general, this is something that's supported by the research as well. However, this is something that I think we need to be a little bit careful with. And what you'll often see is different papers will say, well, the totality of the research suggests that we should reduce our saturated fat intake. But we need to keep in mind that the totality of research also contains multiple decades where all of the research was bent towards reducing that fat. And the idea was, well, that's going to have better outcomes for our health. So now, if new research comes out that is a little counterintuitive to that, even if the work being done is really good, it's not going to be enough to change recommendations or guidelines because it's coming up against all of those other years of research that's heading in the opposite direction. But what I find interesting is that even in research papers that are very much in support of the status quo and recommend that reduction in fat and saturated fat, you'll start to see little caveats inserted in those papers. And it makes you think, you know what? Maybe the research isn't as settled as we once thought. This will include things like, although the preponderance of evidence suggests we should reduce our saturated fat intake, correlation does not necessarily indicate causation. Or a paper might state that the standard is to reduce dietary saturated fat intake, but recent reviews have highlighted some controversies. Or even, dietary guidelines continue to recommend the reduction of saturated fat intake. However, advice to do so without regard to dietary nuance could limit positive outcomes and potentially have negative implications for your health. And to me, when I hear that sort of verbiage, I just think it's a fancy way of saying maybe things aren't as clear-cut as we thought. The problem is, although opinions and conclusions in the research community might be changing, we know that there's a huge delay between what the research says and what is being recommended by our doctor. And while sometimes delay is good because it provides extra time for vetting and making sure we get everything right, it can also be hugely problematic because it can delay recommendations that could be potentially helpful for someone who is struggling with their health. In my practice, I see low-fat diets hurting Hashimoto's patients in two key ways. And the first is having a negative impact on our nutrient absorption and our digestion. We know that changes in thyroid function can often negatively affect our digestion, which can then impair our body's ability to break down food and absorb nutrients. And if this is something that we're already having a problem with, then we wouldn't want to limit a certain aspect of our diet that could further impair this process. Fat is a necessary cofactor for the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K. Plus, fat helps us to absorb different types of antioxidants and plant compounds that also can be helpful to our health and immune system function. This is one of the reasons why with so many supplements these days, you'll see that a particular compound is listed as emulsified. Emulsified simply means surrounded by fat, and the goal there is to help improve the absorption of that particular compound. The second way that a low-fat diet can negatively impact Hashimoto's patients is due to the effect that it has on our hunger and satiety levels. Now, we just said that a gram of fat has more calories than a gram of carbohydrates or protein. So if we were comparing things one to one and focusing just on the numbers, then it would make sense that we would want to limit fat as much as possible if we wanted to reduce our overall caloric intake. However, you probably know by now that although calories do have an impact on our health, where we get our calories from is also just as important. Now, though there will definitely be some individual variability in how each of us responds, fat tends to be very helpful for keeping people full longer. And although fat might have more calories per gram than other macronutrients, it appears clinically, and this is something that is backed up by the research, that when we eat a meal that includes more fat with it, although it might be higher in calories, people tend to eat less calories later in the day. Although this might seem a little counterintuitive, this stands in significant contrast to our standard recommendations for calorie reduction and helping people to lose weight. And often in those situations, I find that the typical recommendations cause people to feel very hungry. And while having some hunger is normal and okay, when we're constantly hungry and we're constantly thinking about food, yes, your willpower might be able to carry you for some amount of time, but eventually that hunger is going to win. So whenever we're trying to craft a healthy nutritional approach for an individual, we always want to keep satiety in mind, and including healthy fats, both unsaturated and saturated, can be a great way to do that. Now, although I think it's a great thing that people are including more fat in their diet, sometimes when we hear something is good, we can take it too far in the opposite direction. Because of that, there are a few things that people with Hashimoto's need to be aware of, where having a higher fat or a high fat diet can actually cause some problems for them. The first point that we need to pay attention to, once again, revolves around our digestion. Just like we said earlier in this video and many times before, changes in thyroid function often leads to changes in digestive function. And one aspect of that is a decrease in our ability to make digestive enzymes, which helps us to break down our food. If we're not producing enough hydrochloric acid in our stomach, then that can become an issue for us when it comes to digesting fat. The low pH of the acid is the signal to our gallbladder that says food is on the way. If we don't have that appropriate signaling going on, then we might not have the same efficiency when it comes to gallbladder contraction, which means less bile that's available for breaking down fats. Not to mention the fact that, just like we can have issues with the amount of energy available for the production of HCl, we can also have issues with our production of bile. So low thyroid conditions can therefore impact fat digestion in two ways, both from the signaling pathway and from the overall production, storage, and excretion of that bile. Now, this isn't to say that you should avoid fatty foods completely, but if you've tried to increase your fat intake and you've had problems with your digestion, I don't want it to be discouraging to you, but you need to be aware that it might be something that you need to ease into. Some people who have long-standing thyroid issues or even gallbladder removal may have some difficulty digesting fat for the long term. But if you moderate your approach or provide some sort of digestive aids, you can still find a happy medium where you are getting some fats in your diet and providing that support to your health. The second area where we can get in trouble with a high-fat diet is thinking that all fats are the same. Now, I know I already made the point that I don't think that saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, or polyunsaturated fats are necessarily unhealthy for our body. However, I do think we need to be careful around more processed fats, including things like trans fats and also fats that are distilled from vegetable or seed oils. Now, I know there's a lot of debate around this subject, and I don't 100% have all the answers. But some people will say that these processed oils are only an issue for us because they are highly used and therefore we're taking in more calories than we're aware of. On the other hand, some people are saying that these processed oils are uniquely harmful for us. And even though we are overeating them, they also have some properties that are pro inflammatory and can independently be damaging to our health. The funny thing is, no matter what camp you're in, both sides tend to recommend a reduction in things like canola oil, cottonseed oil, soybean oil, corn oil, and the list goes on. My hunch here is that there's probably something more going on than it just being a calorie thing, but no matter what, as we work to increase our fats in our diet, we want them to be as healthy as possible. And I think choosing fats that are naturally forming in plants or in animals are a much better option than some of these oils that are heavily chemically processed. And finally, our last point of trouble is going to continue along that same line of thinking, which is that overeating fats, even the healthy ones, can be an issue. Now let's address a few things. As you work towards a more whole food based diet and you remove some of the processed foods, you do have to find a way to increase your calories through those whole food sources. And oftentimes, when we remove those processed carbohydrates, an easy way to balance the scales is by increasing our healthy fats. However, for some reason, some people think that once their carbs are managed, fat is almost like a free food, and they can have whatever they want, whenever they want, and it shouldn't cause them any issues. Can fat be nourishing and satiating to us? Totally, we already covered that. But it can be overdone, especially if someone has been struggling with their nutrition for a long time, and some of those normal satiety mechanisms don't work as well as we would like them to. Fat is still a fuel, and it either needs to be burned and utilized or stored away for later. And if you're someone who has a significant amount of weight to lose, you've been diagnosed with metabolic syndrome, or your triglycerides are starting to exceed 100 milligrams per deciliter, then these are all indicators that your body isn't managing its fuel well, and in fact, you're in a state of fuel toxicity. More fuel is available than is required, which can then be detrimental to your health and eventually lead to symptoms. You guys know that, when appropriate, I love to leverage low carb and ketogenic ways of eating. In fact, I recently made a video on the most low carb approach of all, which is the carnivore diet, and I'll link that for you if you're interested. But something that happens fairly frequently is I will have a patient who comes in and they're following a keto plan, but even though they heard from everyone that it's a great way to lose weight, they're not seeing any success or progress with it. Why is that? Well, when we dig a little bit deeper, we find out that they have these specific fat macros that they've been recommended, and they're trying to add fat to everything to achieve those specific percentages. Now again, there can be certain situations where that might be appropriate, although my general inclination is to not give people percentages, as I often think that it distorts the way we approach our nutrition. However, for most people, adding fat just to add fat and try to make the numbers work isn't always a good strategy and can actually be limiting to us when our metabolism isn't working well. So what do I recommend to my patients? It's actually pretty easy. Choose fatty foods that work for you and eat that fat in its whole food form, whether it's part of a steak, fish, eggs, olive oil, nuts and seeds, or avocado. If you want to add some extra fats to cook with, add a little bit of flavor, or maybe make a salad dressing, that's great too. But stay away from the processed and refined fats. Be mindful that it can cause you to way overshoot the amount of recommended calories that you should take in, and don't go out of your way to add tons of extra fat to every dish you make. Lastly, as I always like to recommend, be a scientist. Track how much fat you're actually getting. And if you're not feeling well or you're not happy with your symptoms, make some adjustments and dial the amount of fat that you're consuming either up or down. Once you find yourself being more satiated with your meals and your energy is more stable for you throughout the day, then you'll know you're on the right track. But let me know in the comments what you think about having more fat in your diet. Is it something that you actively avoid, or is it something that you make sure to include? Maybe, just like me, it's been an evolution where you look at things differently than you did a few years back. I'd love to hear your thoughts and hear what's been working well. If you like this video but need more help and are interested in working with me one-on-one, then you can always start that process by sending an email to contact@seattlethyroidhelp.com. Once we hear from you, my staff will reach out, make sure that you qualify, and then set you up with a free consultation. At the consultation, it's absolutely no pressure. I just want to learn a little bit more about your health and your goals, see if I can help you out with some of these things, and then if we feel like things are a good fit, we can make the decision to move forward together. If you'd rather keep learning on your own, then there are a bunch of other resources that are available to you. Of course, you can look at any of the other videos on this channel. You can follow me on Instagram or Facebook for daily information and posts, or you can grab either one of my free downloads, which are listed in the description box. But that's all for this one. I hope that you found it enjoyable and that you learned a lot. And as always, thank you for watching and thank you for the support. If you did like it, give the video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. But my name is Dr. Bodle. I love you guys. I care about you guys. I hope that you're doing well, and I will see you in the next one.